In the small and peaceful city of São Rafael, the routine of the renowned Dr. Alexander Lima followed the meticulous rhythm of his private hospital. Known for his dedication and precision, Dr. Alexander was respected and feared for his rigidity and inflexibility in following hospital policies. He firmly believed that rules were essential to maintaining order and quality of care. However, fate had a twist in his life. It was a rainy afternoon when Clara, a pregnant and visibly desperate young woman, entered the hospital reception. Her hair, soaked by the rain, stuck to her pale, exhausted face. Her eyes, wide and full of fear, searched desperately for help. Without health insurance, she knew her chances were slim, but she had to try. The receptionist, Mrs. Marilda, looked at her with compassion and hesitation. She knew the hospital rules well and knew that her ability to help was limited. Even so, she took Clara to the waiting room and went to talk to Dr. Alexander. "Dr. Alexander, we have an emergency. A young pregnant woman, without health insurance, is in the waiting room. She seems to be in labor and is desperate," said Marilda, with a mixture of concern and hope in her voice. Dr. Alexander, upon hearing the words, felt a growing discomfort. He knew the hospital's policies were clear. No health insurance, no care. It was a dilemma he faced often, but it never seemed to get easier. He got up from his chair, straightened his white coat, and went to the waiting room. Upon entering, he found Clara sitting, with her shaking hands holding her stomach, her pleading eyes meeting his. For a moment, he felt a surge of empathy, but then he remembered the rules he had sworn to follow. "I'm sorry, but I can't do anything without health insurance," he said, trying to keep his voice steady and professional. Clara, with tears in her eyes, tried to argue. "Please, doctor, I have no one. I don't know who else to turn to. My life and that of my baby are in your hands," she begged, her voice trembling with despair. Dr. Alexander felt a pang of guilt, but maintained his stance. "I understand your situation, but my hands are tied by hospital policies." "I'm sorry," he replied, before turning and leaving the room. Clara left the hospital in tears, carrying not only the weight of her pregnancy, but also the despair of not knowing who to turn to. The rain was still falling hard, each drop a reminder of how coldly she had been treated. Dr. Alexander, on the other hand, tried to continue his day normally, but the image of the young woman would not leave his mind. He wondered if he had done the right thing, if the rules he valued so much were blinding him to the true essence of being a doctor, helping those who need it most. That night, while reflecting on his decision in the silence of his home, Dr. Alexander was awakened by frantic knocking on his door. His heart sped up when he heard the insistent sounds. Upon opening the door, he was surprised by the sight of a baby wrapped in an old blanket left on the doorstep of his house. Next to the baby, a crumpled note with shaky letters. "Please take care of him. I can't." The shock was immediate. He knelt down, took the baby into his arms, and as he looked into the child's innocent eyes, he felt a crushing weight of guilt. How could he have been so insensitive? He knew, deep down, that he needed to correct his mistake. That night in São Rafael was especially cold and humid. The rain continued to fall heavily, hammering the roofs of the houses and forming puddles on the cobblestone streets. At Dr. Alexander's house, the silence was broken only by the rhythmic sound of raindrops hitting the windows. He had spent hours reflecting on his decision not to assist Clara, trying to justify to himself that he had done the right thing. However, the image of his desperate eyes never left her mind. The night wore on, and tiredness finally took him to bed. He fell asleep, but his sleep was restless, disturbed by fragmented dreams and the constant sense of guilt. Suddenly, he was awakened by a distinct sound, frantic knocking on the door of his house. They were strong and insistent, cutting through the early morning silence. Dr. Alexander quickly got up, still half asleep, and walked to the front door. When he opened it, he was surprised by a sight he would never have imagined. A baby, wrapped in an old blanket, rested in a basket on the doorstep. The rain was falling on the basket, but the baby seemed to be protected by the fabric. Next to the baby, a crumpled note caught his attention. With trembling hands, he took the note and read the words written in shaky, desperate letters. "Please take care of him. I can't." The shock was immediate. He knelt down, took the baby in his arms, and felt the weight of the little life against his chest. The baby, eyes closed and with soft skin, he was quiet, as if he instinctively trusted that he was safe. Dr. Alexander looked around, but the street was deserted. Who could have left the child there? It's because, taking the baby inside, Dr. Alexander began to process the situation. He felt overwhelmed by an avalanche of emotions: surprise, concern, but most of all, deep guilt. How could he have been so callous in refusing help to Clara? Was that baby hers? Questions swirled in his mind as he tried to calm the child and warm him up. His home kitchen, usually organized and impeccable, became a setting for improvisation. He heated some milk, not sure if he was doing everything correctly. He wasn't a pediatrician, but he knew enough to make sure the baby was fed and warm. As he held the bottle, he watched the small lips sucking the milk with desperate intensity. He wondered how anyone could abandon such a defenseless child and how desperate Clara must have felt. After feeding and changing the baby, Dr. Alexander sat in the living room armchair, holding the sleeping child in his arms. He looked at the serene little face and felt an overwhelming wave of responsibility. From that moment on, he knew he had a duty to fulfill. He needed to not only take care of the baby, but also find Clara and correct the mistake he had made. As the baby slept peacefully, Dr. Alexander made a decision. He would go to the hospital in the morning, even though he knew he would break the rules by taking the child without authorization. He needed to make sure the baby was okay and, at the same time, start the search for Clara. He called Mariana, a social worker who knew the hospital's policies well and who, despite the strict rules, always showed compassion to people. "Mariana, I need your help. I found an abandoned baby on my doorstep, and I think it might belong to a patient I saw today," he explained quickly, trying to keep his voice steady. Mariana, on the other end of the line, listened carefully. She knew that Dr. Alexander was not the type to ask for help lightly. "Of course, Dr. Alexander. I'll be at the hospital early tomorrow. Let's solve this together," Mariana replied, her voice full of determination. With the plan drawn up and the baby safe in his arms, Dr. Alexander felt a strange calm. The journey that began was uncertain and full of challenges, but he was determined to correct his mistake. That night, as the rain continued to fall, Dr. Alexander rediscovered the true meaning of compassion and the responsibility he carried as a doctor and human being. The sun had barely begun to rise in São Rafael when Dr. Alexander arrived at the hospital, carrying the baby carefully wrapped in a blanket. The streets were still wet from the previous night's rain, and the city was slowly waking up. He entered through the back door, avoiding the curious eyes of colleagues and employees, and went directly to the pediatric ward where Mariana was already waiting for him. Mariana, a middle-aged woman with a kind and determined look, was aware of the situation since the call the night before. When she saw Dr. Alexander enter with the baby, her eyes were filled with concern and determination. "Good morning, Dr. Alexander. How is the child?" she asked, approaching to assess the baby. "He looks fine, but we need to do a complete exam to be sure," replied Dr. Alexander, handing the baby to Mariana, who immediately began examining the child. While Mariana carried out the exams, Dr. Alexander could not shake the feeling of urgency and guilt that tormented him. He knew finding Clara was a priority, but he also needed to make sure the baby was safe and healthy. After a series of tests, Mariana concluded that the baby was healthy, but needed constant care. "He's fine, just dehydrated and a little malnourished, but nothing that we can't solve with care and adequate nutrition," said Mariana, with a reassuring smile. "Thank God," murmured Dr. Alexander, feeling temporary relief. "Now we need to find Clara. She must be desperate." Mariana nodded and, together, they began to plan the search. Dr. Alexander knew that Clara was a young orphan who had recently moved to São Rafael in search of a new beginning. Without family and few friends, Clara was truly alone in the world. Mariana suggested that they start with the guest house where Clara was staying. When they arrived at the pension, they were greeted by the owner, Dona Isabel, an elderly, soft-spoken lady. "Dona Isabel, we are looking for Clara. Do you know where she is?" Mariana asked, trying to be as delicate as possible. Dona Isabel sighed and shook her head. "Clara left last night and didn't come back. She was very downcast, poor thing. She tried to ask the hospital for help, but they said they couldn't help her. I haven't seen her since then," she replied, with sadness in her voice. Dr. Alexander felt a pang of guilt upon hearing those words. He knew he was the reason why Clara was in that situation. He and Mariana asked the other guests, but no one knew Clara's whereabouts. They then decided to go to Clara's work, a small restaurant in the city center. There, they met Letitia, a co-worker of Clara, who confirmed that the young woman was being followed by a mysterious man. Clara was always scared. She said that someone was following her, but we never knew who she was, said Letitia, worried. Mariana and Dr. Alexander realized that the situation was more serious than they imagined. They then decided to go to the police station and speak to the police chief, Mr. Carlos, a fair and experienced man. "Deputy, we need your help to find Clara. She is in danger and left a baby in the care of Dr. Alexander," explained Mariana. Chief Carlos listened attentively and, upon realizing the gravity of the situation, promised to mobilize the team to help in the search. "We will do our best to find Clara and ensure her safety," he said firmly. While the police began the search, Dr. Alexander and Mariana returned to the hospital to take care of the baby. With each passing moment, the urgency to find Clara increased. Dr. Alexander felt more determined than ever to correct his mistake and ensure that Clara and the baby were safe. At the end of the day, exhausted but determined, Dr. Alexander and Mariana knew that the journey was just beginning. They were ready to face any obstacle to save Clara and rediscover the true meaning of compassion and humanity. As the search for Clara continued, Dr. Alexander and Mariana realized that they needed more information to find her. The baby, now fed and resting, was safe at the hospital under the care of dedicated staff. Dr. Alexander, however, could not shake the constant worry from his mind. He knew that Clara was in danger, and that time was crucial. They decided to start looking for any clue that could lead them to Clara. The first stop was the guest house where Clara had stayed. Donna Isabel, always helpful, allowed them to enter Clara's room in the hope of finding some clue. The room was simple, with little furniture and a window that faced the street. Clara's clothes were neatly folded in a suitcase, and there were few personal items scattered around the room. Dr. Alexander and Mariana searched the room for anything that could indicate Clara's whereabouts. In a drawer, they found a notebook with notes. Clara had written thoughts, concerns, and, on one page, mentioned a man who followed her. Reading these words made Dr. Alexander feel a chill down his spine. He knew that Clara was scared and that there was something very wrong going on. "Mariana, look at this. Clara was being followed by someone," said Dr. Alexander, showing the notebook. Mariana read the notes carefully and nodded. "We need to find out who this man is. Maybe he has some connection to what's happening," she said, with determination. They decided to go to the restaurant where Clara worked to talk to Letitia again. Letitia, a friendly young woman who was concerned about Clara, was happy to help. "Clara told me that a man was always nearby, watching her. She never knew who he was, but she was very scared," explained Letitia. "Can you remember any details about him? Something that might help us identify him?" asked Mariana. Letitia thought for a moment before responding. "He was tall, intimidating looking, and always wore a black hat. He didn't talk to anyone. He just watched," she said. With this new information, Dr. Alexander and Mariana decided to go to the police station again to inform Deputy Carlos. He promised to intensify the search and keep the team on the lookout for any man who fit the description. Back at the hospital, Dr. Alexander found the baby sleeping peacefully in the nursery. The sight of the child brought a mix of emotions. He felt a growing responsibility, not just as a doctor, but as a human being. He knew he needed to find Clara, not just to right her wrong, but to ensure that mother and son could be together and safe. The next morning, they received a call from the police station. There was a suspicious man who fit Letitia's description, seen near an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. Dr. Alexander and Mariana immediately went there with the police. When they arrived at the scene, they found the man described by Letitia. He tried to escape, but was quickly detained by the police. Dr. Alexander and Mariana watched from afar as the man was handcuffed. As they approached, the man, with a fearful look, angry and full of hatred, he refused to speak. "Where is Clara? What did you do with her?" demanded Mariana, her voice firm and full of authority. The man didn't respond, keeping his gaze fixed on the ground. The police began to search the abandoned building, and Dr. Alexander felt a knot in his stomach. The wait was agonizing. Every second seemed like an eternity. Finally, they heard a scream coming from one of the police officers. "Here, we found something." Dr. Alexander and Mariana ran to the indicated location. In one of the rooms in the building, they found Clara, visibly exhausted and scared, but alive. She was sitting on the floor, hugging her knees, her eyes full of tears. "Clear," exclaimed Dr. Alexander, running towards her. "It's okay now, you're safe." Clara looked at him, and tears began to stream down her face. She was visibly relieved, but still in shock from what she had been through. I thought I would never see my baby again," she said, her voice shaking. Dr. Alexander helped her to get up and, together with Mariana, took her back to the hospital. He knew the journey wasn't over yet, but this was a big step in the right direction. They were determined to ensure that Clara and her baby could have the safe and happy life they deserved. While Clara was being treated at the hospital, Dr. Alexander reflected on everything that had happened. He knew he had learned a valuable lesson about compassion and humanity. He was determined to do everything in his power to help Clara recover and ensure that she and her baby were safe. The journey was still far from over, but Dr. Alexander was prepared to face any obstacle that came his way. At the hospital, Clara was taken to an exam room, where the medical team quickly began caring for her. Dr. Alexander and Mariana stood by, ensuring Clara received the best care possible. Clara was visibly exhausted, with swollen eyes and signs of fatigue on her face. But despite the trauma, there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Mariana held Clara's hand as the team examined her, offering comfort and support. "Clara, you are safe now. We're here to help," said Mariana, her voice soft and reassuring. Clara looked at her and then at Dr. Alexander, who was next to the stretcher, visibly worried. "I thought I would never see my baby again," said Clara, her voice weak but full of emotion. Dr. Alexander felt a lump in his throat when he heard those words. He knew he owed Clara an immense debt, a debt of compassion and care. "You and your baby are safe now, Clara. We will take care of you too," replied Dr. Alexander, with renewed determination. While Clara rested, Dr. Alexander and Mariana went to discuss the next step. They knew that Clara's situation was still delicate and that she would need continued support. "We need to ensure that Clara has a safe place to stay and that she receives the support she needs to recover from this trauma," said Mariana, worried. "I agree. She can't go back to the boarding house and she definitely can't be alone," replied Dr. Alexander, pondering the options. After a brief discussion, they decided that Clara would temporarily stay in a support house linked to the hospital, where she could receive medical and psychological care. Meanwhile, Clara's baby was being well taken care of in the nursery. The hospital staff, moved by the situation, dedicated themselves to ensuring that he was well fed and comfortable. Dr. Alexander often went to the nursery to check on the baby, feeling a growing responsibility for that little life. At the end of the day, Clara was transferred to the support house. Mariana accompanied her, helping her get settled. The house was a welcoming place, with clean, comfortable rooms and a team of professionals dedicated to the well-being of patients. Mariana stayed with Clara while she got comfortable in the room, helping her feel more at ease. "Clara, we will be here for you, every step of the way. Don't worry about anything right now, just focus on resting and recovering," said Mariana, with an encouraging smile. Clara nodded, feeling grateful for the support. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but knowing she was in a safe place helped her relax a little. The next morning, Dr. Alexander visited Clara at the support house. He carried the baby, who was clean, fed, and sleeping peacefully in his arms. Upon seeing the child, Clara began to cry, but this time, they were tears of joy and relief. "Here he is, Clara. Your son is fine," said Dr. Alexander, handing the baby to her. Clara took the baby in her arms and hugged him tightly. tears streaming down her face. It was a moment of pure emotion and relief, and Dr. Alexander felt deep satisfaction when he saw mother and son reunited. "Thank you, doctor. And I don't know how to thank you for everything you did," said Clara, her voice breaking. Dr. Alexander shook his head, still feeling guilty about what had initially happened. "I'm the one who must apologize, Clara. I should have helped you from the beginning. I promise that I will do everything in my power to make sure you two are okay," he replied, sincerely. The following days were dedicated to Clara's recovery and planning a safe future for her and her baby. Dr. Alexander and Mariana worked together to organize the necessary medical care as well as psychological support to help Clara deal with the trauma she had suffered. Mariana also contacted several charities and social services organizations to ensure that Clara had access to resources that would help her rebuild her life. During this time, Clara began to trust Dr. Alexander and Mariana more, seeing in them not only dedicated professionals, but also sincere friends. One night, while Clara was at the group home, Dr. Alexander and Mariana discussed the next steps to ensure Clara could support herself and care for her son. "She needs a stable job and a safe place to live in the long term," said Mariana, with determination. "I agree. Perhaps we can find a position for her at the hospital, something that will allow her to earn a living while still having access to medical care for herself and her son," Dr. Alexander suggested. With this in mind, they spoke to the hospital director, who, touched by Clara's story, agreed to offer her a job in the administrative area. It was an opportunity that would allow Clara to earn a living while she cared for her baby. When they informed Clara about the offer, she was thrilled and extremely grateful. "I don't know how to thank you. This opportunity means everything to me," said Clara, with tears in her eyes. "You deserve this chance, Clara. We all deserve a second chance, and you are getting yours," replied Dr. Alexander, with an encouraging smile. Clara started her new job at the hospital, quickly adapting to her new responsibilities. Meanwhile, Dr. Alexander continued to monitor her and the baby's health, ensuring they were both receiving the necessary care. Over time, Clara began to recover emotionally. Every day, she felt stronger and more confident, determined to provide a better life for her son. Dr. Alexander and Mariana continued to support her, proud to see her flourish. And so, amidst the difficulties and challenges, Clara's life began to take a positive turn. The journey wasn't over yet, but with the support of Dr. Alexander and Mariana, she was on the right path to building a safe and happy future for herself and her son. The discovery about the mystery man raised new questions. Dr. Alexander and Mariana split up, with Mariana investigating the possible stalker while Dr. Alexander focused on taking care of the baby and continuing the search for Clara. Mariana, with her experience, managed to track down some clues about the man Letitia had mentioned. She discovered that he was known in the city for illicit activities, including human trafficking. The situation was more dangerous than they initially imagined. Meanwhile, Dr. Alexander took care of the baby, who began to show signs of recovery under his care. At the hospital, nurses commented on the change in the doctor's behavior, which before was so rigid, now showed unexpected dedication and affection. One night, Dr. Alexander was rushed to the hospital. Mariana was there, and with her, an exhausted and visibly shaken Clara. She had been found hiding on the outskirts of the city, in a state of shock. I didn't know where else to go," said Clara, with tears in her eyes when she saw Dr. Alexander. The reunion was intense. Dr. Alexander felt a mixture of relief and guilt. He knew he needed to help Clara, not just for the baby, but to redeem himself for his own initial decision. Clara, now safe, began to tell her story. She had fled an abusive relationship. The baby's father was a dangerous man who controlled and threatened her. She had no choice but to flee, fearing for her life and that of her baby. The man Letitia had mentioned was a henchman sent by her ex-partner to find her. I didn't want to put anyone in danger. I didn't want my baby to be raised in that environment, Clara said. Dr. Alexander and Mariana listened attentively, understanding the depth of Clara's despair. They decided they needed to ensure her and the baby's safety, while planning a way to confront the danger that was still lurking. With the help of Mariana and the local police, Dr. Alexander devised a plan to lure Clara's ex-partner and his henchmen into a trap. The tension was palpable, but everyone knew that. 12:49, July 24th, 2024, Gabriel Isaac. And that was the only way to guarantee the safety of Clara and the baby. On the night of the confrontation, Dr. Alexander and Mariana were ready, along with the police, waiting for the right moment to act. When Clara's ex-partner appeared, the police quickly intervened, arresting him and ensuring that he could no longer threaten Clara. With the danger over, Clara and the baby were finally safe. Dr. Alexander, moved by the experience, reflected on his actions and the transformation he had experienced. He approached Clara, offering not only medical help but also emotional support and a safe place to start over. Clara accepted, and little by little, she began to rebuild her life with the help of Dr. Alexander and Mariana. The baby, now healthy and smiling, has become a symbol of hope and renewal. Dr. Alexander, once so strict, now understood the true meaning of compassion and humanity. He had rediscovered the importance of small acts of kindness and how they can have profound and lasting impacts. The story of Clara and Dr. Alexander became an inspiration in the small town of São Rafael, showing that true redemption comes from the heart and that, together, we can overcome any obstacle.